Okay, let's start. We are very fortunate to have Professor David Plotke with us, share with us his view about Obama administration and what it has achieved with what it has maybe failed to achieve. And I know, it's lucky me, I got to meet you today. I know Professor Plotke a long time ago because he was already made his name known to many people in 1960s, and he was a very fierce anti-war organizer, of course anti-Vietnamese war,
Right.
At Harvard and at Berkeley, and after that he threw himself into academic studies, published numerous books and articles on American politics, democracy and democratic politics. He's also a very sharp observer of what's going on around us. Let's give him a hand and hear what he's going to tell us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you. In order to prevent, to keep my attention and hopefully to keep yours, I've been in here for a couple days and I'm going to be traveling elsewhere. I try to avoid simply repeating the same talk. So I understand that this is a policy school, so I'm not going to give just a policy talk, but I wanted to begin with some very quite specific poll data about policies that the Obama administration has passed and the way that the American public perceives them, and to use that as an introduction to talking about the political dilemmas facing the Obama administration. So I think I'll do this I don't know if we even have terms like American style or Chinese style or anything else in academic presentations, but I will start by asking a kind of American style question. I'm going to name 5 policies of the Obama administration and see if what you think would be the most popular among American people now. If they're asked, do you approve or do you not approve of this policy? So the 5 are the financial regulatory reform of this year, the stimulus package of 2009, the $800 million stimulus package, the rescue of the automobile industry in 2009, essentially, the rescue of financial institutions, and healthcare reform. If you had to guess, anybody can, I'm not going to really poll you all, but which do you think is the one that gets the highest, the financial regulation? You're correct. In fact, of all these measures, it's the only one, according to the recent Gallup poll, that has a positive rating from the American people. So it gets a 61 to 37 rating, okay? The financial regulatory reform. The stimulus package, in retrospect, is 43 to 52. The rescue of the automobile industry does worse, 43 to 56. The rescue of financial institutions does even worse, 37 to 61. And the healthcare reform, which is only 1 year old and has barely even been implemented so far, not even, has only 39% approval. Okay, this is an interesting package of results. And some of it, I mean, I presume that many of you have studied public opinion and know how it works. At this point, there's no innocent public opinion, and people are always responding to some extent as political actors. So when someone says, I disapprove of the rescue of the financial institutions, that doesn't mean in the most simple-minded way that they really preferred that all the major banks in the United States go broke and collapse. It just means they hate the policy, okay? But you're still saying it's strategic. It doesn't mean it's empty, so you can draw some conclusions about the current electorate, and then that'll lead me to a political conclusion. One is people in the United States now are skeptical, at least skeptical, of large reform projects that entail extensive government regulation and even control of important social and economic activities. Second, people in the United States are durably quite enraged by the inability of any major actor to impose costs on business elites for their mismanagement of the economy in the last few years. Let me underline about that. I see an audience that looks like it has plenty of people from the U.S. in it, so I'm not sure, this will probably be old news to some of you. This is not to be confused at all with the idea that Americans resent rich people. Americans like rich people just fine, and they like to get rich, and they don't, envy is not a big part of the story, but it's the combination of great wealth and incompetence, apparent incompetence, though of course the actual story is more complicated, that causes people to feel that the bankers were not punished. Does that mean people think that Obama should have taken some of them out behind the White House and executed them at noon to make the point to the American people that there are costs to be paid for this? No. Third point, regulation in the United States, though it's not very popular, is much more popular than simple transfers of resources. This is a point that sometimes escapes my friends on the left, who may even have trouble telling the difference between the two themselves. But, for example, the regulatory plan to reshape the financial industry gets the highest response, and it's partly unavoidable. Can you imagine somebody in 2010 saying, the financial industry is just fine, thanks, we don't need any regulation. But it doesn't, the idea of regulation doesn't appall people. Massive transfers, pure and simple, make people very anxious, even in emergency conditions, right? I think, just in my own view, that both the aid to the banks and to the automobile industries was justifiable in terms of a kind of civic or, if you like, macroeconomic conception, but it makes Americans very disturbed, okay? It's not just that it was an upward transfer, it's not exactly an upward transfer, or sideways an upward transfer. The transfer is troubling. Finally, something you all know, but bears repeating for the Obama administration, the policy areas that Obama wants to change are extremely complicated. This is like the oldest news in the world, right? That these are complicated, large areas. But there is a political problem with that that intersects the cycle of electoral politics, which is the following. If a system is complicated, it means two things. One, there's going to be a lot of resistance to changing it, and it's going to be hard to get over that resistance. That's fairly obvious. But the perhaps more politically salient thing right now is the benefits of the regulation are probably not going to show up very quickly. Not by the next electoral cycle, okay? Possible problems might show up right away, but if somebody says, and just think about this, I won't do another exercise of asking you to name the years, how many years will it take for all going well, and let's imagine it's a good piece of legislation, for the benefits of the healthcare reform to become widely present and perceptible? It's not going to be 10 minutes. In the American political culture, and this leads into the more political part of this presentation, the following logic then is hard to avoid. If you are a liberal to left reformer like Obama, you're going to provoke resistance faster than you're going to see the benefits. Right now, the healthcare reform looks like a vast project of government regulation and to some extent government control. What is the main benefit that people now obtain through the new healthcare reform? It may start to be, there's one psychological benefit that I think is widespread, that people now are somewhat more calmed about the prospect of having health care over time. But the number of people who've actually enjoyed that as a benefit so far, okay, is relatively modest. So we can say this is a problem for regulatory politics all over town, whether it's in the United States or anywhere. The problem is transfers are easier to cash out politically, but if the public doesn't want to do transfers and you need to do regulation, then you have the problem durably of, in the United States, when you do the regulation, you provoke a strong anti-statist response in the United States. Not everywhere, but in the United States. And you don't have an immediate recourse to saying, look, what are you talking about? It's not like, this is the classical example that policy reformers use in the United States, Social Security reform, okay? Where even that didn't happen the next day, but it comes fairly soon. So let me put this dilemma more broadly for Obama, and then I'm mainly going to be talking about the upcoming 2010 elections, but we can go back to policy matters more narrowly as you wish during discussion. Basic dilemma is Obama is a serious liberal reformer in a country right now that is center-right and conservative. He has various problems, personally, coalitionally, politically, but his basic problem is that he is politically significantly to the left on key issues of significant parts of the country, especially well-organized parts of the country, and he has to do his best to achieve his reform goals in that context. He was very fortunate in his first 2 years to have an unusually large and strong Democratic majority, which allowed him to get things through. The Republicans, let me begin with a pledge of allegiance of a certain kind. When you give talks like this in another country, in the United States it would be obvious from the first sentence out of my mouth that I'm some kind of Democrat. So it wouldn't surprise anybody, even if my colleague here had not told you about my left-wing history. But when you are elsewhere, you're obliged to say what your politics are just slightly so that people can distinguish between those politics and what might be correct in your presentation. I'm a Democrat. To conclude the thought about Obama, what's going to happen after November is his current difficult situation is going to become much more difficult because his large Democratic majority is going to be gone. I'll discuss a bit the extent to which it will be gone, but he is not going to have a majority that he can get stuff through with very easily. It's going to be much tougher with him. The Republicans, God bless them, when he would pass something by virtue of his congressional majority, they would sometimes be tempted to treat him like he was the Jacobin part of the French Revolution and simply enacting these measures through fiat and threatening to execute opponents when he was just passing bills. But it's going to be much more complicated for him now because he's not going to pass bills in that way. Okay? Here's a quick and crude balance sheet of his first couple of years. On the positive side, I would think these things would be acceded to even by people who would evaluate them differently. He probably prevented the recession of 2008 to 2009 from becoming a much more severe recession. That's a big deal. The unemployment rate in the United States now is quite high by our standards, and nobody knows exactly. Here's the counterfactual for you to think about. Nobody knows it precisely. Let's say the stimulus package had been $200 billion instead of $800 billion, or there had been none. We're probably talking about unemployment 30 to 50% higher than what we've had. That would be my guess. I'm not sure, okay? It's simply, as often in the case of severe economic circumstances, it is both the actual policies he did and the clear commitment to further policies that have the effect of pulling things back from catastrophe. It's the intertwining of the actual money passed out, some of which wasn't really passed out or not very efficiently, and the sense that somebody was in office who was if X didn't work, he was committed to doing Y and then Z. Okay? That's a big deal. He already, if he decided he didn't like the results of the 2000 election, he was going to move to some nice other country and just write his third and fourth book of memoirs. He already goes down as historic among Democratic presidents for having passed the health care reform, which had been a highly valued policy objective of every left-of-center government in the United States since the New Deal. And aside from Medicaid in the 1960s, this was the major such effort. The new plan is not totally universal in the sense that some European plans are, but it probably will get into the 90s in terms of covering people in percentages. What he's done is, and here's what I think is coming, the Republicans are threatening to repeal the health care legislation. Well, not unless they impeach Obama, because they're not going to have a 2/3 majority for doing that. So it's here. And what will probably happen is the health care reform is a huge piece of machinery with lots of moving parts that won't work quite right. But what will endure is the idea that the United States as a country should have a durable policy commitment to extending health care to the vast majority of the population. So that political accomplishment, in my view, will endure long after there is a substantial reworking of different elements of this piece of legislation. He created a new regulatory framework for the financial industry, which repaired a problem that had been left unmanaged by Democrats and Republicans alike for several decades, especially for the previous decades. And here, just so I don't seem like a pure partisan at all, the Clinton administration, with some of the Treasury guys, was as culpable as the Republicans because the hedge fund guys and the bankers said two things to Clinton. One is, you're really smart, Bill, they said, but you're not smart enough to understand this stuff. So getting involved in regulation would be a mistake for you. It's beyond your capacity. And then the other thing they said was, trust us. We don't want our banks to go to hell. Why would we want to crash? We are prudent, risk-oriented bankers, okay? And that was fine with Clinton, basically. Pretty much fine. So it isn't just this. Obama, naturally, in partisan politics, would try to pin the whole banking catastrophe on Bush. That's what politicians do. But in fact, the lack of what happened was old regulations became outmoded. New regulations were not instituted. So then when this catastrophe happens, there's this tremendous policy problem. And you all study or teach about policy, that the work of inventing a regulatory framework for something as complicated as the modern financial industry is a work of many years, right? So that you have to come up with something quickly puts people in a terrible situation, and they passed a plausible beginning on that. Finally, he did one other thing, which I think is terribly important, not in a policy framework, but in a political framework. For 200 years, the United States has elected presidents. We have some constitutional requirements. In addition to the fact that no president could be female, they weren't allowed to vote till 1920, there was one condition for being president of the United States, and it wasn't even unspoken. It was clear for 200 years. He had to be white. Right? This is a job requirement. Obama's election and his competent performance, that is to say, it would be unspeakable in politics for the Republicans or other people to say, as was said in Reconstruction 150 years ago in the United States, well, no wonder things are not working. We have black people in office. That was the prevalent response to the first upsurge of African Americans in American politics. Things are messed up. What a surprise. It's black people running the state senate in Carolina. Whatever people say about Obama, it's indisputable now that when candidates are considered for the next iterations of national electoral politics, it's not disqualifying to be African American. Who knows what they're going to be, right? It's just, in some ways, I don't know how you put it on the same scale, but it's of historic importance comparable to the healthcare legislation, given the particular history of my country. And I would say it's something that even some Republicans who really hate Obama are, at the same time, in some cases, somewhat proud of his election in that way, as a national accomplishment. There have been some serious weaknesses as well that partly provide the framework for the upcoming disaster, to forecast my prediction. Okay? One is, while the recession ended, it ended officially in mid-2009, it has not been followed by any particularly robust growth. In particular, unemployment has remained very high. Okay? In the United States, the national figure is, I think, 9% or a little higher. There's always an argument about what real unemployment is. But 9 to 10% unemployment, to put the problem very simply in the United States, last 30 years or so, the deal in the United States compared, say, to Western Europe is we have not very much social protection, but lots of employment and high wages. Okay? Well, if you cancel part of that deal, people feel very vulnerable because being unemployed and without immediate prospects of employment in the United States for many people is very frightening. Okay? And ample employment at, varied but often decent wages was a unspoken and common solution to many social problems that in Europe might be the subject of complex social engineering. Let me give you one example. In the United States, child care is not publicly provided for the most part. That is for pre-K kids, and it costs a fortune. The common family solution to this problem among the non-poor is working more. Women go from half-time or three-quarters time to full-time jobs. Men go from full-time jobs to time-and-a-half jobs, and the extra income goes straight to the child care provider, whether it's an individual that comes to your home or a service. Okay? Well, that works in a sense that people can do it, but if there's no jobs, you can't do that. So what are you supposed to do then? If you can't get an extra 50%, I would say the cost of, I've seen many studies of this, I forgot the ratio, to support child care for your kid, I'm trying to think what the number would be, just to give you a sense of this. One kid in a good pre-K nursery, has anybody had one in the United States recently? Kid in a good pre-K child care situation. What do you guess the price to be?
15, 20K.
Yeah, so that's what I thought. Because
More than that. It's 25 more than that.
25 to 40, I'd say.
Yeah, it's at least 25K.
let's say it's 25, so we don't devote the whole talk to this. But the point is, 25K for full-time is probably a little high, and it varies by region. However, if you say the 25K, you need 25K income to pay that, how much taxed income do you need? 35 to 40, depending. So for the middle class, and even, you're getting into the professional middle class, that is a half-time job for somebody. It might even, and for many other parts of the population, it's a full-time job. So if there are full-time jobs and half-time jobs, people just basically complain and say, well, that's life. It's a tough life, but that's life. If there's no jobs, then you get into an absolutely unworkable cycle of trade-offs, right? It's just not clear what you're supposed to do. The other thing about this recession that I don't think is, I understand that in Singapore, from another talk, there's a very high rate of home and apartment ownership, correct? I don't know if the story in Singapore is the story in the United States, but over the last 30 years in the United States, the appreciation of home values became the main form of savings for the upper working class and on up in the society, right? But everybody plays at the stock market in the United States. Everybody, okay, has a few $100 or more, just about, unless you're, you know. But most people don't anticipate retiring on the basis of their stock portfolios. Rich people buy houses like most of the people in the audience here probably buy cars. You know, it's a big expense, but you buy the car, that's it. Upper working class and above, people in the United States, the way it worked is you bought a house on a 15 to 30-year mortgage with a 10% to 20% payment. As the housing price appreciated, you had created a quite large pool of savings, potential savings, if you lived in one of the main areas of the United States where housing really appreciated. If you bought an apartment in Manhattan in 1982, well, great, okay? When the housing market bursts, then what's really happening is the life plans of upper working class and middle class people are being devastated. Two things in particular become very difficult. I'm trying to be very detailed about this to show you the political point of this is to explain in some ways why this recession has created so much popular anger and upset in the United States when some of the numbers don't look so terrible. They have 10% unemployment in Germany all the time. France, okay? It's not, okay. What do you use the appreciated value of housing for in the United States? What are two very common uses of it? That anybody who's lived in the United States would have seen your friends do it.
Home equity loans.
And then what do you use the home equity loans for? This is where the life plans come in. First thing you use it for is college. Very common. What does it cost to put one smart, charming young American in a nice liberal arts college or private university for a year now? Full tab, cost of everything. The winner is, again...
No, I can tell you 53,000. I haven't won.
So basically, the proportion of Americans who can write that check out of current income is not very large. Imagine your current after-tax income, you know, of most people, and you say, oh, okay, well, to start with, I do have to write this check for $55,000 for my kid's school, but then I'll do other things, you know? You're talking about a very small part of the population who can actually afford to pay college tuition straight up. One of the main means of affording it is capitalizing the savings in housing. Another one that is really causing people to go nuts, and quite understandably, is the Social Security in the United States is a great system, but it doesn't really cover retirement, depending on how long you've been in it, et cetera, et cetera. The United States would be much worse if we didn't have our Social Security system, but not many people really expect that that's going to do it, okay? So if you bought your house in Chicago in 1984, had your career as an attorney or a school teacher or whatever, the idea is you cash out when you retire, you take the savings, you move to North Carolina, or Georgia or somewhere nice and sunny, you buy a similar house for a third the price or half the price, you have no mortgage left, and then Social Security, absent mortgage and home costs, starts to look a little bit more plausible. If you're in Chicago and your house just went in value from $520,000 to $240,000, which is not unheard of by any means now, you are looking at a lot of very long, cold winters as you head into your 70s and 80s. And well, not even North Carolina. I mean, maybe a trailer park in outside of Albuquerque. So the reason I go into such detail about this is because it's not a normal recession in the United States in its depth or effects on some of the politically significant groups. Okay? The second problem for Obama is it's not, he didn't create this, he doesn't have a credible story about how he's going to slow the growth of federal spending. It would be ridiculous to say that's his fault, that he's supposed to solve a net of problems with that. But it is definitely his fault in the current context, because if we channel Paul Krugman for a moment, who I think deserves all our respect, but some criticism about this, what are you supposed to do to get out of the recession now? Spend a lot more, okay? Well, I think he might actually be right, okay? I'm not an economist, I'm not prepared to swear to that, but if he were right, unless you think that there's you've discovered a magical thing, that deficit spending, as opposed to all other good things, has no potential negative consequences, that if you do deficit spending with no plan to curtail government spending in the future, you have some obvious economic problems coming up. And Obama is now in a difficult situation about that. He can't just go to Congress, even if he had a nice Congress, and say, Paul is correct, I was chicken the first time, let's double down on another billion, excuse me. And then the First Republican or Conservative Democrat says, and then? He says, well, let's see about it later. Let's just do it. The irony is if the economy were worse, he might be able to do that. That is, if we're facing the Great Depression again. But just a rotten, uncomfortable, disgusting economy is not going to get that through without some conception of how you're going to deal with overall levels of spending. The simplest way to put this, as I said it before, is that Obama finds himself in a conflict between his reform projects and the shape of public opinion, the structure of political opportunities. And the payoff is going to be, just to state it provocatively so we can begin a discussion before too long, I think what you would say is we're now at the end of the reform phase of the first Obama administration. That is the phase in which the main dynamic of politics nationally was Obama declaring certain reform initiatives, some of which he got through, some of which he didn't, and then the Republicans responding, and then, fighting over it. Okay, the premise of that was that he had a sufficient congressional majority to pass whatever he really felt that he had to pass. If he didn't want to pass something, or he feared its political consequences, well then, it didn't happen, okay? Right now, there are about 250 Democrats in the House in the United States, and about 175 Republicans. The normal midterm loss over the last 7 or 8 electoral cycles is about 20 seats. Let me put a caveat or parentheses around that. This is a public policy school, so I presume you're all made to take some version of introductory statistics or introductory macro, so you know that generalizing with a data set of 8 observations is not statistically very sound, right? Especially when there are kind of 2 outliers in it that make it confusing in certain ways. But still, what you say, if the average outcome occurs, what will happen is Democrats will retain nominal control of the House, but lose effective control. Because for those of you who aren't familiar with American politics, our parties are not all that disciplined in the House, and there are plenty of conservative Democrats who cannot be told by Obama how to vote no matter what the issue is, okay? It's not the British parliamentary system where if the budget comes up, well, let's say if you're in the British Parliament, you're in the British Parliament for 2 minutes, and the budget comes up and you refuse to vote for it. What happens to you if you're in the party of the government? And anybody, what becomes of you?
I think, if my memory serves me right, they have a free whip. Yeah, free whip. And then
Basically, what happens is you lose your seat pretty soon. That, to put it bluntly, maybe you stick it away. Maybe you don't get forced out at that moment in Parliament, but your chances of representing that constituency in the next election for that party are done. As opposed to the American system, if you're a conservative Southern Democrat from South Carolina and Obama says, I want you to vote this way on this bill, 50% chance you say no precisely to improve your electoral prospects in the next election. Say, my opponent, the Republican, says I'm virtually a socialist and I always vote for Obama. Let me show you 5 instances where I told him to stuff it, okay? Very different dynamic. I would say current prognostications, dire ones, are 30 to 40 seats. I think it'll end up being less than that because one of the things about American midterm elections, turnout is very volatile, much less than in presidential elections. At the last minute, what is going to happen is there'll be a little bit of an uptick, my guess, in Democratic voting because they see what's happening, and that may limit the losses somewhat. But we're about to be in a situation where the Democrats don't control Congress, where Obama doesn't. Now, what happens next? Well, we have one recent example of that is probably pertinent, that's very interesting. And one of the things about American politics is the fate of the parties and the president are not as tightly linked as in a parliamentary system or as in semi-presidential systems. So he can do a reprise of Bill Clinton, okay? Which is essentially to the term that I'm sure many of you remember was triangulate. To say essentially, in this weakened situation, I'm going to take a distance from the Congressional Democratic Party. I will continue to be mainly antagonistic to the Republican Party, and all going well, this will allow me to be reelected in 2012. The reason why, and I want to be respectful of time, and so I'm going to just bring this to the conclusion in a moment, this is obviously, as it was in the last 2 years of Clinton's first administration, the end of reform projects, but not the end of Clinton by any means, okay? There's a certain dynamic that even makes that more likely. In midterm elections, let me see if I can save it a couple minutes. How many people are familiar with the way the primary system works in the United States? Not that many. When I was young, back in the 1930s, as he said, when I was a student activist in the 1920s and 30s at Harvard, the primaries existed in the United States, but they weren't a defining feature of our political life. Now, all serious political contests for national office involve party primaries. What it's like, to put it simply, and I mean to connect it to Obama's situation, is stuffing a parliamentary multi-party spectrum into 2 parties. So the Tea Party, which you've all heard about, is in effect a right-wing libertarian faction of the Republican Party in primary politics. If you combine a primary system with federalism, what that means is candidates. The traditional thing about American politics used to be to claim parties were all the same. Downsian dynamics run amok. Everybody went to the center. With a primary system and federalism, you can have parties producing candidates very far to the right and the left at the local and state levels. Okay? There's the woman running against Reed in Nevada is very far to the right. The woman in Delaware is not only far to the right, she's a nut. I don't know if you're familiar with this. If she were a Democrat, she would have been forced out of public life already. She said, among other things, that in 1998-99, she flirted briefly with witchcraft. Okay? Now, if a Democrat said that, you can only imagine that their Democrats are already suspect for not being close enough to Jesus. If somebody said that, they would just be gone, all right? Why is she not gone? Because the Tea Party upsurge, given federalism and a primary system, allows a candidate like that to win a state primary, right? This is an obvious dilemma. I'm not supposed to tell this kind of jokes at serious audience, but the far right of the Republican Party who suspects that Obama is really or secretly a Muslim is in Delaware confronted with a terrible theological and doctrinal problem, which is it worse as a senator to have a Muslim or a witch? And I'll leave that to that part of the Republican Party to figure out the theological problem. But here's the possible benefit, and then I'll show you the argument within the Republicans. Possible benefit is if these Tea Party candidates do well, they create a situation in which the more centrist parts of the Republican Party are saddled with that going into 2012. What the Republicans would say, and they are saying, is essentially, we are politicians, not long-term investment managers. We discount the future rather heavily. Thanks for your concern about being burdened with these people. We want to win now, and we'll figure out how to clean these people up by 2012. But it's not so simple. So there's this dynamic that helps Obama. The other dynamic I'll conclude, not with a Sarah Palin story, a negative joke about her, but with a thought, with asking you to be McCain in 2008, and you'll see the other problem the Republicans have, and then I'll just open it for discussion. Why did McCain nominate Sarah Palin? What people now easily say, what was in that man's mind? Well, you know, why did he do that? Anybody remember? Huh? Energize the right, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the other thing that must have happened, I mean, this is serious politics. The guy's running for president. He had his committee, whatever the committee was, bring him dossiers on the 5 to 7 other plausible Republican candidates at that time. To use a card game metaphor, sometimes when you're behind, when it looks like you're losing, you're much better off making a risky play than standing pat and knowing you're going to lose. So all the Tim Pawlenty's and what's his name in Louisiana, Bobby Jindal, all these guys have had their chance to pass muster, and to McCain at least, who is a smart guy, what it looked like was, if you pull one of these guys, we are going to steam respectably and sort of carefully toward a 45-point, 46-point win. Tim Pawlenty's not even going to help me win Minnesota necessarily, okay? Bobby Jindal is not going to guarantee Louisiana. He went through him. So let's put our money on Sarah Palin and see what happens. That's the other interpretations that energizing the right is true, that he would rather, I mean, this is another way of saying it, he obviously would have preferred to have dinner with her than with Tim Pawlenty, as who of us, male or female, would not make that choice about who you're going to have as a dinner partner. Problem is, now for the Republicans, okay, put very simply, do you think that Obama loses any sleep at the prospect of running against Sarah Palin in 2012? If he had his way, because he's going to get so beat up in 2010, it's going to be nasty, and if his life were on a DVD or an old CD, he would just press, if he knew that were coming, he would just press fast forward until September 2012 and imagine himself debating Sarah Palin. So the Republicans have a problem, and I'll end this on this point. The policy stuff seems over. The big reform policy stuff seems over for the next couple of years. Obama's popularity seems likely to be low, as long as the economy continues to be terrible. However, Obama has several moves left in both policy political terms that make him a plausible candidate in 2012. And to complete the poker metaphor, what you certainly can't do in poker is beat something with nothing. The problem is that, and this is again dating myself, people who criticize Obama have various complaints to make about his leadership style, but compared to almost all the other American presidents who I have sat with and through and under in the last decades, he's not hated. Far right tries to work something out, but that's very tricky territory, and they don't even really hate him. Everybody I remember, and those of you who are either in the States or watched the campaigns, starting with Nixon, certainly, well, Johnson even, Nixon was hated by many opponents. Carter was loathed in various ways. Now, he wasn't a horrible person, but he was loathed. Reagan was hated by the left. Papa Bush was despised by the left. The Republicans went nuts with Clinton before Monica Lewinsky, as he seemed crude, dishonest, sleazy. They hated him. Okay, and Bush I don't even need to say about. So facing Obama in 2012 as a serious, decent politician who you disagree with deeply, the Republicans right now are in a great deal of trouble, so they will not be wise to get too excited about the wonderful electoral victory that they're about to win. Okay, I'll stop there so we have a half hour or so for talking.
Thank you so much for this enlightening speech. And now the floor is open. And Ruiza, you have to introduce yourself briefly, and please be brief in your question. And please do not make a comment. The question is more than welcome. Mike is there.
My name is David White. I just recently stepped down as chairman of Democrats Abroad, so I also have a political agenda here in Singapore, chairman. One of the weaknesses is his lack of a story of how to get out. An obvious one to me would be to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan, but is there any possibility in the world that he could do that and not have the American public go absolutely bonkers?
Boy, that's a whole nother lecture, so let me try to be brief about it. You might reasonably ask, why in my account foreign policy played such a small role? And the answer is, foreign policy is actually playing a pretty small role in the midterm elections now. There's a tendency, structural tendency, for that to be true, because when the president is in charge of foreign policy, when his election is not in question, foreign policy goes to the side. More complicated answer, though, is the depth of disagreement about those particular issues has been greatly muted in the United States, and Obama does not have an interest in making those issues. The only votes he gets on either of those are on the Democratic left, and if you think that anybody after the Ralph Nader catastrophe of 2000, if you think anybody on the Democratic left is going to refuse to vote for Obama in 2012 because he's not getting out of Afghanistan fast enough, it's just not going to happen. The signal story here, and I'll just give you 2 minutes of a potential 2-hour lecture, is very interesting and surprising. Obama thought he was going to be an anti-war candidate when he was thinking about this. And he was, to some extent, 2007, 2008. He crafted his approach to Iraq at the moment of worst performance, worst violence, worst prospects of that war. Okay? He didn't think, Bush didn't really think this all, no matter what he says. They didn't think Petraeus would be as successful as he was in 2006, 2007. Nobody thought that, okay? So that created the following dilemma for Obama. Once it becomes clear that Not that Iraq is going to be turned into Denmark and become a lovely place, but that it's going to go from hell to a very tough political situation. What exactly is Obama proposing to accomplish by a more rapid withdrawal than is probably possible anyway? What exactly is the payoff here, okay? It becomes a very hard situation for him to justify. That's the real dilemma. And he has a different problem on Afghanistan that is more serious for him. I don't know how many of you actually remember this, but this was a big deal in the United States. The Democrats repeatedly, after 2002, said, Iraq is a war of choice, not something we can really support because we are never persuaded, regardless of the question of honesty about the intelligence and so on and so forth, we're never persuaded that this was a war the United States had to fight. Afghanistan, the intervention there, while arguable in certain ways, was a response to an attack on the United States and was a war of necessity. I'm giving Obama's discourse, okay? So in 2008, if you say something's a war of necessity in 2005 and 6, in 2008 to say, whoops, I'm getting out, puts you in a doubly untenable position. One, do you have a foreign policy? He was charged with making that claim about Afghanistan for purely instrumental reasons. That is, he wanted to have a way to beat up Bush on Iraq and not appear totally to be a pacifist in American terms. So he said, this war I support. Well, he supported that when it wasn't quite the horror show that it is now. But if he says, well, I want to get out of Afghanistan, well, what's the reason for that? Well, it's because it's a war. And then he's in trouble. He can't really do that. And the sign that it is his war is bringing in Petraeus, right? So this is a very long-winded answer to your question. I'm sorry, but I thought I would cover this area. Obama, the only thing Obama gets out of talking a lot about Iraq and Afghanistan is a fight with his left and explaining over and over to them why things are not going to happen as they wished. And if he's anything, he's a smart, good politician. So that's about the last thing he would want to do in 2008. Republicans, if I can extend this a little more, the Republicans have the following problem. They don't disagree with Obama's foreign policy nearly as much as they expected to, though they disagree in some respects. So if you watch Fox, which apparently you can get here, sometimes they are reduced to saying that the problem with Obama is he doesn't sound like Bush. And the problem with that is essentially, well, that's why he got elected. And that's why some of his policies are more successful than Bush's. So asking him to start yelling at people appropriately, and he has several opportunities, misunderstands who he is, and simply offers what it really does, and they're not stupid either, is Bush has started to become people don't like him yet, but his figure is softening in memory. If you start to say, sound like Bush, be tough like Bush, be just like Bush, gradually what you're threatening is a prospect people say, oh, now I remember. Now I remember why we came to hate Bush so much, these guys are talking about. And now, says the apathetic and ambivalent centrist, I'm going to vote. And they're not going to vote for the Republicans. So that's the foreign policy stuff. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dayan Jayatilaka, formerly Sri Lanka's ambassador to the UN in Geneva. 3 quick questions. 1, do the Republicans have a viable Stanley McChrystal or David Petraeus option in 2012?
A viable what?
A viable option of either Stanley McChrystal or David Petraeus as a candidate in 2012. There's 1. 2, would the thunder on the right push President Obama into some military action against Iran as Jack Kennedy was pushed into Vietnam? And the third and final question is, did didn't President Obama have the option of a Rooseveltian New Deal when the mood in the country was not really center-right, when he was elected to office, when he could have gone the route that Joe Stiglitz, Krugman, Robert Reich indicated of more assertive reform, which should have kept Main Street with him and not allowed it to drift to a right-wing populism?
Those are great questions, and I'll try to restrain myself from doing what I did with your colleague and answering them each for 25 minutes. Let me take the third one. I think you're misreading what public opinion was at that time, that it was populist anger, but not a demand for a full-scale restructuring of the American political economy. Hating bankers, wanting to see some of them punished, wanting to see them behave better, wanting to regulate banking, is not the same thing as wanting whatever you might imagine had been a full-scale. Even healthcare was assailed bitterly, and part of the reason it had such trouble was the claim was that Obama was using the opportunity of economic crisis to impose a social democratic course that the public didn't really support. Okay, and if you think about how close that line of argument came to derailing healthcare, imagine how it would work on things where it was really true, had they been attempted. So that I don't think. McChrystal and Petraeus are well, let me put it this way. If Eisenhower were alive, he would be a center-right Democrat. Petraeus is a Republican nominally, but he's a sort of East Coast liberal-ish Republican, and the Republicans would have they are so far right that faced with the almost irresistible opportunity of winning with Petraeus, that I don't think they would go for it. And on his side, he went to graduate school at Princeton in the 1980s. He hangs out with liberal academics. I'm not going to say he's a social democrat. He isn't. But he is by no means someone who would find it temperamentally comfortable to be there's an even better example, which I just failed to think about. Petraeus on politics is probably one notch to the left of Colin Powell. I mean, we don't know for sure, but that would be my pretty clear guess. Colin Powell didn't run for president, both because he didn't want to be for president, but because he knew he would get beat up in the Republican process, and on a number of issues, mainly social. He's not a left-winger on economic policy, but on cultural and social issues, he doesn't like the Republican Party. If you had Petraeus over in that corner, and it was in as much confidence as this session, for example, and you said, David, what's your view of gay marriage? He'd probably say, I absolutely don't care. I'm not going to crusade for it, but if people want to do it, it's fine. That in the Republican Party now, that's okay. The third question is deadly serious. I think the person who has the possibility of triggering a military confrontation with Iran is unfortunately the head of Iran. And I believe that, I think two very complicated things are going on right now, okay? I think the reason that the government of Israel wants to be relatively accommodating, in terms of some ways they might be behaving, is they very much want to create a situation in which the U.S., they, and the Saudis can focus on Iran rather than deciding which settlement on the West Bank needs to be dismantled. So maybe that will result in a deal, maybe it won't, okay? But I don't think they, or the Israelis, or the United States wish to attack Iran. Though sometimes parts of public opinion in Israel will say things that, you might read that way. I think they understand that that's not. The problem is the American counter option to sanctions plus the ultimate threat of some military action failed, which was, in the short term, which was democratic reform, that the regime survived, that the real hope of the United States, and I think this is true of all but the ultras in Israel, was not that there would be a just abnegation of the nuclear program in Iran, but that the regime would either be softened or changed in such a way that having, to put it totally bluntly, to having a couple bombs in Tehran wouldn't put the Israelis in mortal terror, okay? So the regime, if not regime change, at least regime reform was the strategy. The problem is, like, I guess this is my political prejudice coming out, because I always forget the guy's name. He went to the UN, and he basically said that the US caused 9/11, okay? Now, is that going to cause the United States to attack Iran? No. But my fear is, so I can see a sequence that has the following way. He interprets Obama's restraint as weakness and pushes and pushes and pushes, and then a situation arises, not where I guess you could say the right will somehow be in the background of the United States, but military action arises in a situation where Obama feels pushed too far. I don't give that more than 15%. But I think that is the likely way. It's a misperception. So to just use that as an example, the next day in the New York Times, Obama didn't go on TV to say that this was, to say this was the most out. He said it was terrible in almost the professor voice I'm using now. That was really terrible, okay? It's possible that that could be misinterpreted as weakness or lack of passion, and then he keeps pushing. And this is how wars used to start, not contemporary insurgency, counterinsurgency wars. This is a story of late 19th, early 20th century wars where misperception leads to engagement to bad things. So I didn't do much better than I did with him, but slight degree of, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Rena. I'm with the Middle East Institute here at NUS and Georgetown University master's program on hold. You ended on the note, I apologize in advance for being inarticulate and cynical, but
That's a lot of apology. It's barely begun.
You ended on the note that you don't think that Obama is hated, and I agree with you. I think I would label it fear. I think Obama is feared, and it's fear of the unknown or of the other, whether that fear is being implanted or it's instinctual in either case. And I think, in other words, that's racism. And I'm wondering, you put Obama's race in your category of accomplishments, where I would have put it in the challenges, because do you not attribute any of this conservative backlash, this Tea Party behavior, as racism? I'm curious.
Just for the sake of, look, since this is obviously a sophisticated audience, which I say not to pat you on the head, but just to say, of course, when there's a far-right in ferment in the United States, there's some racism around. But when Clinton was president, and he's as white as you can get, the far-right was blowing up buildings in Oklahoma City and in a frenzy that they haven't reached yet. So the idea that Obama's African-American heritage makes him a special target is, I guess, I don't want to, you weren't inarticulate at all, but you were ahistorical, okay? Because we have such strong recent evidence of whenever a Democratic president is in power, part of the far right goes nuts. And the center right has a hard time disciplining them, okay? So I'm not trying to dispute that some of the anti-Obama stuff is tainted with racial antagonism. How could it not be, okay? But I would even go so far as to make the case that the net effect of Obama being black is to tone them down a little bit, because they have to be so careful about that very thing. The first time some Tea Party guy gets up in Michigan and uses the N-word 5 times and says we have to change American politics the way it's supposed to be, blah blah blah, they're done. They're just done in a Republican primary. So I would say, if I had to give this is as cynical as you are, but in a different direction. I would say the Democrats probably get a small net benefit out of him being black with the Tea Party, because it makes them a little more civilized than they would have to be, out of fear of the political consequences. American politics has really changed from the 60s and 70s, or even from Jackson in the 80s. You can imply things, but you just can't make racial attacks on people. I have the otherness thing, where some people would start out, is he really a citizen? Is he really a Muslim? Here's another explanation for that I'm saying, and again, not to totally deny you, and in a joking way. Part of the problem with Obama is he's like us. He's a highly educated, liberal, coastal, yuppie, elite intellectual. He doesn't have what he doesn't have, except for part of the African American population, is a clear bunch of folks in the United States that he fits right in with. Okay, Bush had his guys, mostly guys. Clinton had his men and women. They say he's one of us. Okay, who Obama really is. He, after his very interesting childhood, he went to elite private universities in the United States. He taught at University of Chicago Law School. He was in politics. He was a lefty community organizer. He's you. No, you hear what I'm saying. He's one of you in the audience. And when people say he's aloof or he's distant, I think, again, I'm not denying the complexity of your comment. Some people say, what's this Hussein business? Okay? But I think for other people, he seems like a Hyde Park, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Columbia, Upper West Side guy who isn't one of them. And but to fill that out, I'm going on all sides of this. I'll give you one final part of this, and this is his cultural problem, which is partly about race. Imagine you're white people in the United States, or you at least have read about them. Okay, what are you scared about with black men? What's scary about black men, or could be? What forms of expression, forms of behavior of black men make you nervous? But short of that, what are the attributes? Obviously, those are the racial fears. But what is it about black men? Let me give you the example of in a campaign. Well, basically, what you're scared about is black men act real angry, extravagant in gesture, too intense, too much. Remember during the race that Obama was saddled with this pastor, Jeremiah Wright? He was not a rapist or a murderer, but he was the sort of black person that a lot of white people find very uncomfortable. He yells at you, says white people are going to go to hell, and half of them should. And he scares people. So what Obama has had to do about race is, and I have tremendous respect for him in this area, he's had to navigate a very difficult problem. If he is too affectless and too sober and too restrained and too careful, he appears like a yuppie or a wimp, and somebody who doesn't really care about the suffering of the people on the Gulf Coast, the unemployment people. If he's angry, gets too angry, he's Jeremiah Wright. So he has to walk this careful line of figuring out how to be expressive without upsetting people. And I think he's done a pretty good job of that, actually. And I think that it's an extremely difficult emotional task for that. So who didn't? Clinton. Actually, that's a good comparison. Clinton had Clinton's stereotypic way of, he would get pissed off about something, sorry for my language, get all red in the face, started yelling, and people would say, well, great, that's what these Southern white guys do. He's a good old boy. It's good to see him get good and angry. That's just fine. If Obama did that, then the people you're thinking about say, oh my God, we got Jeremiah, we got Amiri Baraka as our president when we thought we were voting for Barack. So I think there's race around in American politics, but there's few things I'm unambiguous about. I think it was unambiguously great that the United States elected an African American, and I think the net positive of that continues. I would think that was great even if it had been Colin Powell. Since I'm also a Democrat, I think it continues to pay off, and will even pay off in the following way. There will be some centrists in 2000 for Obama. Okay, this is not an Obama campaign event, but I'm just trying to explain how it works. There'll be some centrists in 2012 who will not think that Obama did a very good job, but will feel guilty about voting against him. There'll be others who feel the opposite way. They'll be racist, glad to get rid of him. But people are, this is not a small attack, this is not a small cultural thing for the United States. And I tried to give it some drama here, but it really was, how many, you're all math people, how many presidents were elected since 1789, just roughly? 44, no, there's more. How many presidential terms were filled? It'd be in the 50s, right? 50 straight times, the citizens of my proud country voted for a white guy. And then they voted for a black guy. Okay, that's a big deal. I think that, I can tell you're to the left of center, which is fine. But I think if you're going to inhabit that political location in a way you can live with, and I'm sorry to sound like such an old fart in telling you this, you need to take pride in accomplishments, and not be too quick to say, well, what kind of big deal was that? It was a really big deal. Anyway, that's my sermon. That's my Jeremiah Wright moment, young lady.
Okay, one more question. Already over your phone.
Hi, Professor. Thanks very much for your presentation. Okay. My name's Eric Sandland, and I used to work in the Reagan administration, so I'm not completely part of the love fest, but I completely agree with you that as an American, being proud of having an African American elected as president is a great accomplishment. I'm also a banker, so I'm a bit hurt by some of the stuff that's been going on lately. But I have a specific question, because you touched on it with the triangulation point. I invest for a living, and when I look at the future, the big question for me is, will President Obama, post the midterms, come down as a pragmatist or remain on principle? So will he triangulate, or will he stay clear of the center? And I'd just be curious what your thoughts are on the probabilities of those two outcomes.
It partly depends, this is to not debate you about your Republican heritage, but it partly depends on what kind of Republican Congress he gets, okay? If he gets a Gingrich fiesta, then he might figure, what the hell? Why compromise with these guys? There's no payoff. Let's just have gridlock, and we saw that did Clinton some good. And so then he's not going to go to the left of where he is, but he's just going to go straight where he is, right? So that's a strategic judgment you would make. If people are not willing to compromise with you, then what's the payoff of trying to compromise when it's just going to make you look weak? If it's a more mixed and complicated Republican or Republican-ish plus conservative Democrat Congress, he has every incentive to not triangulate in a hostile way, but triangulate in a nice way and try to get things done. So I'm betting the second, because you'd have to presume some learning curve for the Republicans too. They saw that their congressional behavior after 1994 made the subsequent elections much tougher for them than it needed to be. They lost in '96. They had a bad candidate, but in 2004 they were greatly burdened. They won, or whatever they did in 2000. He got elected, then they won. They were burdened by that heritage of seeming to be not responsible as governing. So I think they'll think it's. So what I would predict is a steady dribble of unexciting centrist legislation post 2010, because I think it's in the interest of both parties to do. And just to conclude, to tie it back, I think the only way in the next 2 years, and perhaps the next 4 if Obama gets elected, to use my contrast between banking regulation and health care. Policy reform measures that seem to be, to use the war metaphor, reforms of choice, are going to be very hard for Obama to get through. Reforms that seem to be reforms of necessity, I think will probably go forward. But that distinction, it was his desire in 2008 to blur that distinction with an aggressive reform agenda by declaring many things to be of necessity. The fact that I agree with him doesn't make it impossible for me to see him blurring that distinction. It will be very, very hard for him to do that after 2010.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Plotke, and let's give him a hand.
Thank you. That was fun.
Yeah, very much.
Good.